On the afternoon of July 17, 1994, the air in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, hung heavy with summer heat, the kind of day where sound seems to carry farther, where even the smallest movements stand out against the stillness. Just after 3 o'clock, 12-year-old Ethan Miller said goodbye to his friend Daniel after an afternoon of playing video games in Daniel's basement. He was heading home on his bike, a 10-minute ride at most. Witnesses would later remember him, a lanky boy with sunburnt cheeks and a baseball cap turned backwards, pedaling casually along River Road. It was a familiar route, one he'd ridden hundreds of times before. But that day, something, or someone, interrupted it. By 4 o'clock, Ethan's mother, Margaret, began to wonder why he hadn't come through the door. At first she assumed he'd stopped to talk to someone or grabbed a snack at the gas station. But when the minutes stretched into an hour, her unease grew. She called Daniel's house, expecting to hear that Ethan had decided to stay longer. Daniel's mother confirmed he had left on time. That was when Margaret stepped outside, scanning the quiet street, her voice carrying as she called his name. No answer. Around 5:15 p.m., a neighbor walking her dog along River Road noticed something strange. Against an old wooden fence, about halfway between Daniel's house and the Miller's home, Ethan's bike stood upright, the kickstand down, as if it had been placed there intentionally. There was no sign of damage, no skid marks on the road, and no scattered belongings. It looked less like a bike abandoned in haste and more like one carefully parked before its rider stepped away. When the neighbor mentioned it to Margaret later that evening, Margaret's stomach sank. Ethan never left his bike unattended, not even in their own driveway. By nightfall, the local police had been called. Officers began by searching the immediate area, backyards, sheds, and ditches along the road. When darkness fell, they brought in flashlights, their beams cutting through the high grass by the roadside. Margaret and her husband, David, followed close behind, calling Ethan's name into the shadows. There was still a belief in those early hours that maybe he'd wandered into the woods and gotten turned around. The forest that bordered River Road was dense and confusing, a tangle of trails and deer paths that could easily disorient a child. By morning, the search had grown. Dozens of townspeople volunteered, forming lines to comb through the brush. Police dogs were brought in, their handlers leading them toward the place where the bike had been found. For a brief moment, there was hope when one of the dogs caught a scent leading toward the old railway embankment, but the trail abruptly ended near a patch of muddy ground, where boot prints and tire tracks overlapped and blurred in the damp soil. Heavy rain had passed through the night before, washing away anything that might have told them more. Helicopters joined the effort, circling low over the tree canopy, their blades chopping the thick summer air. From above, volunteers looked like scattered ants moving methodically through green and brown. Divers searched the river despite the lack of evidence suggesting Ethan had gone near the water. No backpack, no cap, no soda bottle. Nothing of his was recovered beyond the bike. By the second day, the mood shifted. The initial assumption that Ethan had simply got lost began to fade. If he had been in the woods, the search teams would have found something, a piece of clothing, footprints, or signs of shelter. Instead, there was nothing. Investigators began to consider other possibilities, an accident with a vehicle, an encounter with someone passing through town. But River Road wasn't a highway. It was a quiet 2-lane stretch where strangers stood out, and yet not one person could recall seeing anything unusual that afternoon, aside from the boy on his bike and, later, the bike without the boy. As hours turned into days, the search perimeter expanded. State police joined in, and flyers bearing Ethan's school photo appeared on every shopfront and telephone pole. Margaret couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She paced the kitchen, the phone never out of reach, answering every call with the same sharp, breathless hope that quickly dissolved when it wasn't news about Ethan. David tried to remain steady, spending long hours walking the search zones, his shoes coated in dust and river silt. By the end of the first week, reality began to take hold. The official search scaled back, leaving only a few detectives to follow up on leads. Most were dead ends, sightings of boys who looked like Ethan in towns miles away, or anonymous tips about strangers in vans. The Miller family went from living in the center of a bustling search operation to sitting alone in their quiet house, the front porch still lit late into the night in case Ethan came walking up the driveway. In a town this small, silence carried weight. People stopped Margaret in the grocery store to offer theories or sympathy. Some whispered about kidnappers, others about accidents covered up by frightened drivers. None of it brought her closer to the truth. What remained was the image of that bike, standing perfectly still by the fence, marking the spot where Ethan's life in Millbrook simply stopped. By the end of the summer, the case was already slipping into that limbo where missing person investigations often go. A file on a desk, a photograph in a drawer, and the hollow echo of questions that no one could answer. The only certainty was that a boy had left his friend's house one hot July afternoon, started down River Road toward home, and never made it there. It would be 28 years before anything connected to him would surface again, and when it did, it would be in a way no one could have imagined. In the days following Ethan Miller's disappearance, investigators began the painstaking process of piecing together his final known movements. The timeline was fragile from the start, a puzzle built from scattered witness statements, some clear, others vague and conflicting. They knew he had left his friend Daniel's house just after 3 in the afternoon, heading toward River Road. From there, the trail fractured into fragments that didn't quite fit together. One of the earliest calls came from a young gas station attendant who claimed Ethan had stopped by around 3:30. He remembered because the boy had been alone, which struck him as unusual for a kid that age, and because Ethan had paid with a crumpled dollar bill for a cold bottle of orange soda. The attendant described him as calm, polite, and in no hurry. The problem was, when police searched the scene where the bike was found, there was no sign of that soda bottle, no discarded cap, no empty plastic, nothing. Later that same afternoon, another potential lead surfaced. An elderly woman who lived along River Road told officers she had seen Ethan talking to a man in a faded blue pickup truck parked just off the shoulder. She couldn't recall the man's face in detail, but she remembered the truck clearly, rust along the wheel wells, a dented rear bumper, and a loud idle that rattled as it sat there. According to her, the conversation seemed friendly, not tense or hurried. Ethan had been standing next to the open passenger side window, one hand resting on his handlebars, nodding along as the man spoke. When she glanced back a few minutes later, the truck was gone, and so was Ethan. Detectives tried to track down the vehicle, circulating its description across the county and beyond, but no one matched it to a registered owner. State police even stopped a few similar trucks on the highway in the following weeks, yet none of them led anywhere. The more time passed, the more these sightings began to feel like fragile threads, easily snapped under the weight of uncertainty. They widened their net to include anyone Ethan might have known who owned a truck, friends of the family, distant relatives, neighbors who had recently moved away. Interviews piled up in the case file, but every single lead either came up clean or couldn't be corroborated. And then came the uncomfortable question, what if the person responsible wasn't a stranger at all? Investigators quietly turned their attention toward Ethan's own family. Statistically, harm to children often came from someone within their circle. Detectives looked closely at the Millers' home life. David Miller, Ethan's father, worked long shifts at the paper mill and was known as a quiet man, private but well-liked. Margaret was a homemaker, active in the local church and known for her devotion to Ethan. Both parents were asked to take polygraph tests. They agreed without hesitation, and both passed. Still, some officers couldn't shake the possibility that something had happened at home and that the bike by the fence was staged to mislead investigators. There was no evidence for it, but in the absence of answers, theories grew in every direction. The community began to divide into camps. Some believed Ethan had been abducted by a passing driver, lured or forced into a vehicle in the small window of time between sightings. Others suggested he might have run away, though that theory felt thin. Ethan had no history of trouble at home, no money, and no known destination he might have been heading toward. He hadn't packed clothes or taken anything from his room. His banked allowance, a small jar of coins on his dresser, was untouched. Weeks into the investigation, the official timeline looked less like a straight path and more like a cloud of uncertain moments. 3 o'clock. He leaves Daniel's house. Around 3:30, possibly seen at the gas station. Somewhere after that, maybe the blue pickup sighting. Then nothing. It was as though he had stepped into a gap in the day, a place where time moved without him. and by the time the world noticed, it was too late to catch up. Officers retraced the route again and again, imagining every possible turn he could have taken. They knocked on doors, questioned workers at nearby shops, and stopped hikers coming off trails. The lack of physical evidence was suffocating. No soda bottle, no dropped personal items, no sign of a struggle. Even the bike offered no real clues. Its frame was clean, the tires intact, and the chain well oiled. It looked like it had been placed where it was found, by someone who wanted it noticed but left nothing else behind. Theories became both a comfort and a curse: abduction, runaway, accident, cover-up. Some investigators leaned toward the idea that Ethan had known his abductor enough to approach a vehicle willingly. Others argued the opposite, that this was a crime of opportunity, fast and calculated. Without proof, each possibility felt as real as the next. Margaret clung to the hope that the gaps in the timeline meant her son was still out there, somewhere, that maybe he had been taken but was alive, waiting to be found. David tried to shield her from the darker theories, but the police were honest. Without new leads, the trail was growing cold. As summer gave way to fall, the investigation slowed, not because anyone wanted it to, but because there was nowhere left to push. The last confirmed image of Ethan in the minds of the investigators was of a boy on a bike, somewhere along River Road, seen by people whose memories blurred at the edges. After that, the picture fractured into guesses. And yet, somewhere in those fractured accounts lay the truth, hidden behind the same questions they had been asking since the first day. Where did Ethan go after that final conversation, and who was the man in the blue pickup? It would take decades before any piece of that afternoon would resurface, and when it did, it wouldn't come from a witness or a confession, but from something that appeared quietly, in the dead of night, on a doorstep that had been waiting for 28 years. The stretch of River Road where Ethan's bike was found quickly became the center of the investigation. It was a quiet, two-lane ribbon of asphalt that curved along the edge of the forest, with the river running deep and slow on one side and a steep embankment rising on the other. The nearest houses were scattered, their mailboxes sitting far from the road, connected by long driveways that vanished into the trees. It wasn't a place where you'd expect something to happen in broad daylight, but it was also the kind of place where, if it did, there might be no one around to see it. Searchers spread out from the spot where the bike had been neatly propped against the weathered fence. Volunteers pushed into the undergrowth, their boots crunching over leaves and twigs. State troopers paced along the road, eyes scanning the ditches for anything: a piece of clothing, a scrap of paper, a sign of struggle. That was when one of the searchers, moving along the muddy bank just off the road, spotted it. A partial shoe print pressed into the damp earth. It was small, roughly the size you'd expect for a 12-year-old boy. The tread was faint, but there was enough there to make the search team pause. For a moment, hope flared that they had found the first physical trace of Ethan since his disappearance. But hope didn't last long. The night before, a heavy summer storm had rolled through, pounding the area with rain. By the time evidence technicians arrived to cast the print, the edges had begun to slump and dissolve into the mud. It was impossible to say for certain if it was Ethan's. There was no way to lift it, no way to match it definitively to the sneakers he'd been wearing. As quickly as it appeared, the lead slipped away. The rain hadn't just washed out the print, it had scoured the entire area. Any tire tracks, footprints, or disturbed vegetation from the previous day were gone. It was as if the storm had erased the hours that mattered most. Detectives walked the road over and over, noting how few blind spots there actually were. If a vehicle had stopped there for any length of time, it should have been seen. Yet not one driver had come forward to say they'd noticed anything unusual. As the days passed, River Road itself began to change in the minds of those involved. It was no longer just a location. It became the line between what was known and what was unknowable. On one side of the road was Ethan's life as it had been, witnessed and remembered. On the other was the void that swallowed him. Somewhere between those 2 points, the thread had been cut. Then came the talk of the drifter. Several locals claimed they'd seen a man camping near the river in the weeks before Ethan vanished. He was described in vague, shifting terms: tall in some accounts, average in others, long hair to some, short to others. He was said to have a bedroll and a fishing pole and was sometimes spotted near the rusting remains of an old railway trestle just beyond the tree line. Officers checked the spot, finding only a flattened patch of grass and a few empty cans. No one could confirm the man's identity. Word spread that he had left the area just after Ethan disappeared, though no one could say for certain whether he left on his own or was driven out by suspicion. Without a name, he was just another ghost in the file. The old railway line that bordered the road offered another unsettling possibility. Long disused, it cut a narrow, overgrown path parallel to the road, connecting to a network of trails and service roads that could carry someone miles away without ever being seen from the main road. Detectives walked stretches of it, noting the broken boards and rusted rails, the way the undergrowth seemed to swallow anyone who stepped too far from the gravel bed. If someone had wanted to vanish from River Road without being followed, it was the perfect escape route. Despite every sweep of the area, the fence where the bike had been found remained the investigation's grim centerpiece. The bike had been placed there carefully, standing upright, the kickstand locked, the front wheel turned slightly toward the road. To investigators, it was almost too neat, too deliberate. It suggested intention, the way someone might pose an object to make it found. Whether it was meant as a message, a distraction, or simply a way to dispose of it without drawing attention, they couldn't tell. As weeks turned into months, River Road stopped being just a search location and became a place people avoided. Locals whispered about it, telling their kids not to ride alone there. The once peaceful stretch now carried a weight that was hard to shake. For the investigators still working the case, it was the point where Ethan's life seemed to simply fold in on itself. Whatever happened to him had happened there, or had started there, and every unanswered question seemed to lead back to that narrow ribbon of road between the river and the trees. It would remain in their minds for decades as the place where a boy was last seen alive, the place where his bike was left behind like a marker in the dirt. And though the search had ended, the road itself remained untouched, unchanged, holding on to its silence. No one knew then that, 28 years later, something connected to that spot would resurface, not in the mud, not in the woods, but on a doorstep, carrying the weight of all those years in its worn and faded laces. In the months following Ethan Miller's disappearance, the case shifted from an active search to a hunt for leads, any lead, that might explain what had happened on River Road. At first, the tips came in a steady stream. People swore they'd seen a boy who looked like Ethan in nearby towns, or traveling with an older man at a rest stop. Others claimed they'd heard something suspicious the day he vanished, a scream in the woods, a car door slamming shut. Most of these accounts were easy to disprove, but each one had to be checked, and every time a tip was eliminated, it left behind the same emptiness. By the 1-year mark, the calls had slowed, but the desperation to find answers had not. In early 1996, a surprising development came from Ohio. A convicted felon serving time for unrelated crimes contacted authorities, claiming he had taken Ethan. The man, in his mid-40s, was already known to police for a history of violent offenses against minors. In letters and interviews, he gave a chillingly detailed account of the day Ethan vanished, how he had been driving a pickup along River Road, how he had pulled over near the fence, and how he had lured the boy into his vehicle with the promise of a ride home. He described Ethan's clothing, his bike, and even the backward baseball cap. At first, detectives thought they might finally have their man. But as they pressed for more, the cracks began to show. The timeline the man described didn't match witness accounts. He claimed to have dumped Ethan's bike in a roadside ditch, not propped it against a fence. He named a route out of town that would have been closed that week due to construction. Investigators soon realized he had pieced together his story from publicly available articles and televised news reports. It was a performance, a grotesque attempt to claim infamy. When confronted with the inconsistencies, he backtracked, then shut down entirely. Another dead end. Later that same year, a new lead emerged from an unexpected source. A retired truck driver contacted police after reading about the case in a true crime magazine. He claimed that a week before Ethan vanished, he had stopped at a traveling carnival set up in a nearby county fairground. While there, he noticed a young boy matching Ethan's description working behind one of the game stalls. The driver thought it odd because the boy looked too young to be part of the crew and seemed nervous when anyone approached. Investigators looked into the carnival and learned that it had indeed passed through the area days before Ethan disappeared. The workers were a transient mix, laborers, performers, and vendors who traveled from state to state, often leaving little paper trail. Hoping they had found a new direction, detectives tracked the carnival's next scheduled stops. But by the time they reached them, much of the crew had already moved on, some having quit, others replaced. The few they managed to interview denied seeing Ethan or knowing anything about his disappearance. Without names or locations, the trail evaporated. Like so many leads before it, this one dissolved into speculation and frustration. Each tip, each hopeful moment demanded resources. Officers pulled from other duties, hours spent chasing rumors across state lines, money allocated for travel and testing. The emotional toll was worse. Every call to Margaret and David Miller from the police carried a flicker of possibility, a moment when their hearts would race in hope, only to be crushed when the truth emerged. By 1997, nearly 3 years after Ethan vanished, the weight of false starts and broken leads had worn everyone down. The case file had grown thick, stuffed with reports, witness statements, and maps marked with circles and arrows that led nowhere. The local police had done what they could, but without new, credible evidence, there was little more they could justify in an active investigation. That year, the decision was made to archive the case. It wasn't closed, not officially, but it was no longer active. The news devastated the Millers. For years they had cooperated with the media, standing in front of cameras to plead for information, showing Ethan's school photos and smiling family snapshots to anyone who would listen. But with each televised appeal came more tips that turned to nothing. More strangers offering theories that only deepened their pain. Eventually, the public exposure felt less like hope and more like reopening a wound that would not heal. Margaret stopped granting interviews first, retreating into the confines of her home where Ethan's room remained untouched. David followed not long after, declining calls from reporters and even from advocacy groups for missing children. They didn't stop searching in their own way. Margaret still clipped any article that mentioned unidentified remains and still called detectives when she heard about missing boys in other states. But they did it quietly, away from the public eye. By the end of that year, Ethan's case had become another unsolved file in a cabinet, the type that only gets pulled when a new piece of evidence turns up by chance. For most in Millbrook, the story had settled into the realm of memory. A sad tale retold to newcomers, a reminder to watch their children closely. For the Millers, it was an open wound, made worse by the knowledge that the truth was out there somewhere, locked away in the life of someone who had never been caught. No one could have known then that the case, long dormant and gathering dust, would be pulled from storage more than 2 decades later, not because of a confession, not because of a breakthrough in technology, but because something from that summer day in 1994 would reappear, unannounced, at the very doorstep where Ethan had once been expected to come home. In the years after Ethan's disappearance, Margaret Miller learned that silence could be louder than any sound. It wasn't the absence of news that weighed on her. It was the knowing that somewhere, in some corner of the world, the truth existed, and she didn't have it. When the police had nothing left to pursue, she picked up where they left off, not as an official investigator, but as a mother unwilling to stop looking. She cleared out the dining room and turned it into a command center, the table pushed against the wall and replaced by a corkboard so large it took up nearly the entire space. On it, she pinned school photos of Ethan, maps of the county, and lists of every known sighting, no matter how unlikely. There were newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, all carefully dated and annotated in the margins with her own notes, questions, contradictions, and connections she thought the police had missed. Strings of yarn connected points on maps, marking possible routes Ethan could have taken, or paths someone might have used to take him. She kept a separate notebook filled with contact information for retired detectives, private investigators, and journalists she'd reached out to over the years. Some were polite but distant. Others listened to her theories with the kind of sympathetic patience that said they didn't believe her leads would go anywhere. Still, she documented every conversation, every scrap of advice. When the internet began creeping into everyday life, Margaret saw a new opportunity. By 2000, she had learned how to navigate early message boards and online forums dedicated to missing children. She created posts with Ethan's photo, his age-progressed sketches, and the story of his disappearance. Strangers from across the country would comment, offering support, theories, or sightings. Most turned out to be mistaken identity, but each one was investigated as if it might be the lead she'd been waiting for. Margaret spent nights hunched over the glow of the computer screen, scrolling through posts, following links, and emailing people she'd never met. She began keeping binders, thick, heavy volumes that documented every tip she'd ever received. The first binder was labeled 1994, 1996, the next 1997, 1999, and so on. By 2004, there were 6 of them, each one neatly organized but thick with unanswered questions. Visitors to the house rarely entered the dining room anymore. It felt less like a home and more like a private archive. Every inch of wall space was covered, every shelf stacked with binders, manila folders, and boxes of evidence copies she had requested from the police under public records laws. This relentless focus began to strain her marriage. David had handled his grief differently, quieter, more inward. He still believed in looking for Ethan, but he couldn't live inside the case the way Margaret did. He avoided the dining room entirely, unable to look at the photographs without feeling the weight of time pressing down on him. Their conversations became brief and strained, often circling back to the same argument. How much of their lives could they give to a search with no end in sight? By 2005, they were living separately. David in a small apartment across town, Margaret in the house they'd shared with Ethan. The dining room remained untouched, preserved exactly as it was when the case had been fresh. Margaret adapted to solitude with the same determination she brought to her search. She took long drives on weekends, retracing the route from Daniel's house to where the bike had been found, parking in the same spot and walking the same ground. Sometimes she'd wander into nearby towns, visiting gas stations, diners, and parks, scanning faces for someone who might be older now but still recognizable. She became familiar to locals in places miles from Millbrook, the woman with the flyers and the questions. Her walls filled with age progression images of Ethan, portraits created by artists and computer software showing him at 16, 18, and 20. Each new image was both a comfort and a wound, a glimpse into a life he might have had, frozen in a version of time that didn't exist. Friends urged her to take breaks, to rest, to accept that there might never be answers. She nodded politely, but every morning she returned to the dining room, adding new pins to her maps, updating timelines, and chasing leads. There were still moments when the phone would ring late at night, and Margaret's pulse would quicken before she even picked it up. Most of the time, it was nothing. A wrong number, a telemarketer, or a neighbor calling about something mundane. But in those brief seconds before she answered, she allowed herself to imagine it was Ethan, that he was alive, that he had found a way to call, that the knock she'd been waiting for all these years was just moments away. By the mid-2000s, Margaret's life had narrowed to a routine built around waiting. She kept the porch light on every night, even in the summer when the days stretched long. She still checked the mailbox with the faint hope of finding an anonymous letter, a clue, or something only she would recognize. But the knock never came. The only sounds in the house at night were the creaks of the old floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. And though decades would pass, Margaret never allowed herself to imagine the search ending. Not until something would arrive on that same porch years later, worn and quiet, carrying the weight of 28 years in its tattered soles. By the late 2010s, the story of Ethan Miller had all but slipped from the consciousness of Millbrook. The houses along River Road had changed owners more than once, new families moving in with no memory of the boy on the bike or the search that had once gripped the community. The old fence where his bicycle had been found was replaced with a newer one, its weathered boards torn down and burnt by someone who never knew their significance. The people who had been neighbors back in 1994 were older now, some gone entirely, and conversations about the disappearance happened less and less. For most, it had become just another small-town tragedy buried under years of everyday life. But in the police archives, tucked into a row of gray filing cabinets in the corner of a storage room, the case still existed. Inside, a thick, worn folder were photographs, typed reports, handwritten notes from detectives long retired, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age. The name, Miller, Ethan, was printed on the tab in fading ink, a reminder that the case had never been closed, only left waiting. It had not been touched in years except for the occasional audit where an officer would confirm the file's presence and return it to its place among other cold cases. In early 2022, Detective Rachel Kerr was assigned to the Millbrook Police Department. At 29, she was younger than the case itself, but she had grown up in a neighboring county and knew of Ethan's disappearance through old news reports. One slow afternoon, while sorting through archived files for a departmental review, she came across the thick folder with his name. She flipped it open, expecting to skim it out of idle curiosity before moving on, but the more she read, the more she felt the pull of unanswered questions. The details were all there. The bike found against the fence, the orange soda sighting, the mysterious blue pickup. But there were gaps in the narrative that bothered her. It was the witness statements that first caught her attention. The gas station attendant had given his account 3 times over the years, and each version was slightly different. Small changes in the timing, what Ethan was wearing, and whether he'd been smiling or serious. More puzzling was the elderly woman's account of the man in the faded blue pickup. She had initially described the man as mid-30s, clean-shaven, but in a later interview she referred to him as older, maybe in his 40s, with stubble. Even the truck's description shifted subtly. At first, she'd mentioned a dented rear bumper, but months later she recalled a broken taillight instead. Kerr knew memory was unreliable, especially with the passage of time, but these changes hinted at something more than simple forgetfulness. She read deeper, tracing every mention of the pickup through the file. There had been no other sightings of it after that day, and the license plate, if it had existed, was never recorded. The search for it had been thorough for the time, but 1994 was decades before license plate readers or surveillance cameras could have made the job easier. Kerr wondered whether the truck had even been local at all, or if the witness had misremembered a common vehicle. Still, the fact that the description appeared in multiple early statements kept her from dismissing it entirely. Kerr didn't announce her interest in the case to her colleagues. The department had limited resources, and cold cases were often viewed as unwinnable drains on time. Instead, she began working quietly, taking the file home on weekends, scanning documents into her laptop so she could cross-reference them against modern databases. She submitted a request to have any preserved evidence re-inventoried: photographs, physical items, even the soil samples from the original shoe print near the bike. She knew the odds were low that anything remained usable, but technology had advanced in ways that could make even the smallest fragment valuable. Her biggest hope lay in DNA. If any items from the scene had been kept properly, scraps of clothing, the bike's handlebars, anything Ethan might have touched, there was a chance of extracting trace evidence. More importantly, if that evidence pointed to someone whose DNA was now in a criminal database, the match could be instantaneous. She filed the necessary paperwork to have the state crime lab re-examine the stored evidence, framing it as part of a departmental cold case initiative, though in reality there was no such initiative. Weeks passed as she waited for the lab to respond. In the meantime, she began looking at people who had been in the area in the summer of 1994 but were no longer around: temporary workers, seasonal laborers, and drifters. She cross-checked their names with criminal records, searching for any that intersected with known offenders in the decades since. Most of the leads went nowhere, but the process only deepened her conviction that something in the original investigation had been missed. In conversations with a few retired officers who had worked the case, she heard a familiar refrain. It had been one of those mysteries that seemed solvable in the early days, only to unravel as every lead collapsed. They spoke of the frustration of chasing rumors, the exhaustion of searching the woods, and the helplessness of standing in front of the Millers without answers. Kerr listened carefully, noting the names and dates they mentioned, filling in gaps that weren't in the official reports. By the summer of 2022, Kerr's quiet review of the case had grown into a personal mission. She didn't know if she could solve it. Most cold cases stayed cold, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this one still had threads to pull. When the call from the state lab finally came, It was the first tangible movement in the investigation in over 2 decades. They had found something, something that might connect the past to the present in a way no one could have predicted. And within weeks, that connection would manifest not in the lab, not in the archives, but on a doorstep, in the form of a pair of shoes that hadn't been seen since the day Ethan disappeared. On the morning of October 12, 2022, the air in Millbrook was cool and still, the kind of autumn day where the leaves seemed to hang in mid-turn before letting go. Margaret Miller stepped out onto her front porch with a small watering can in her hand, tending to the potted chrysanthemums she had placed along the railing. It was an ordinary routine, one she'd repeated for years, but this time something stopped her mid-step. At the top of her porch stairs, placed squarely in the center of the welcome mat, sat a pair of sneakers. They were worn, scuffed along the sides, the white rubber edges dulled to a permanent gray. The laces were frayed and the canvas was stained with dirt. They looked old, decades old, but intact, as if they had been stored away somewhere and only recently brought into the light. Margaret didn't have to pick them up to know what they were. Her chest tightened, her breath caught. These were Ethan's shoes, the same brand, the same size, the same faint blue stripe running along the heel. And when she finally crouched down and turned one over in her hands, the confirmation was there, small but unmistakable. 2 faded letters written in black marker on the inside of each tongue. E.M., his initials. Margaret sank into the porch chair without realizing she'd moved, the sneakers heavy in her lap. She hadn't seen them since July 17, 1994. They had vanished with him, part of the outfit he'd been wearing when he pedaled down River Road for the last time. Now, nearly 3 decades later, they were here, without a note, without a message, without an explanation. Her first thought was to call the police. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing silently in the daylight. The responding officers treated the shoes like evidence, photographing them in place before carefully placing them into separate evidence bags. They asked Margaret if she had touched them. She admitted she had, but only after recognizing them as Ethan's. She explained about the initials, about how she had written them herself before the start of summer that year so he wouldn't lose them at the park. Neighbors came out to watch as the scene unfolded, drawn by the presence of the police. Word spread quickly, and within hours, half the town knew that something connected to Ethan had been left on Margaret's doorstep. For those who remembered the original case, it was like reopening a wound they'd learned to live around. For newer residents, it was a story they'd only heard in passing, suddenly alive again in the most unsettling way. Detectives canvassed the area, checking with every house on the block to see if anyone had captured something on their security cameras. Most of the footage showed nothing unusual, no vehicles slowing down, no strangers walking past, until one homeowner 2 doors down offered a recording from the early hours of that morning. The camera, positioned near their garage, had picked up faint audio of footsteps on the pavement at exactly 3:14 a.m. The sound was slow and deliberate, followed by the faint creak of a wooden porch step. Then, nothing. No car starting, no voice, no second set of footsteps. Whoever had left the shoes had either approached and left on foot or had parked far enough away to avoid detection. The footage was grainy, the angle wrong for capturing the porch itself. No face, no figure, not even a shadow was visible. Just the sound of those footsteps, each one measured, unhurried. For the detectives, it was both something and nothing, a confirmation that the shoes hadn't simply been misplaced or accidentally dropped off, but also a reminder of how easily someone could come and go without being seen. The shoes were sent to the state crime lab immediately, but the emotional impact of their return hit long before the results would come back. Margaret spent the rest of the day in a fog, replaying the possibilities in her mind. Was this meant as a clue? A threat? A sick joke? Or was it a gesture from someone who had held on to them all these years and finally decided to give them back? The thought that they might have come from someone who knew Ethan in his final hours, someone who had been with him, was almost too much to bear. That night, the porch light burnt brighter than it had in years. Margaret sat inside by the window, staring at the empty mat where the shoes had been, waiting for something else to appear. Nothing did. But the return of the sneakers shifted something in the investigation. Detective Rachel Kerr, already quietly working the case, now had a tangible link between 1994 and the present. She arranged for a full forensic workup, knowing that after 28 years, any surviving evidence would be fragile at best. When the news of the discovery reached the local paper, the town reacted with a mix of fascination and unease. Old neighbors called each other to share their theories. Some swore the shoes meant Ethan had been alive long after the police assumed he was gone. Others saw it as a cruel trick by someone seeking attention. A few believed it was a deliberate signal that the person responsible wanted the case opened again. For Margaret, the meaning was simpler and more painful. The shoes were a piece of her son, worn by him, touched by him. They were proof that he had been real, that he had walked out into the world and left something behind. She didn't know yet if she wanted the answers that might come from them, but she also knew there was no turning back. The shoes had come home, and with them, the possibility that the truth, no matter how dark, might be closer than it had ever been. The lab results would take weeks. In that time, the porch where the shoes had appeared became, once again, a point of quiet watch. Margaret left the porch light on every night, half hoping, half dreading that whoever had been there at 3:14 a.m. might return. Because if the shoes had found their way back after 28 years, then maybe, just maybe, something else would too. At the state crime lab, the sneakers were treated like a relic pulled from another era. Technicians photographed them from every angle before beginning a meticulous examination. The stitching, the wear patterns, and even the way the laces had been tied were documented. It didn't take long to confirm what Margaret had already known in her gut. These were Ethan's shoes. The serial numbers on the inner tongue matched the manufacturing batch sold in the region in the spring of 1994, and the faded black initials were consistent with ink applied decades earlier. But the more revealing discoveries came when the shoes were analyzed under microscopes and advanced spectrographic tools that hadn't existed when Ethan vanished. Trapped in the creases of the soles was a combination of materials that didn't match the soil from Millbrook or any of the surrounding counties. Lab analysis identified it as a blend of common dirt and a specific type of industrial dust, fine particles mixed with trace amounts of milled grain husk and lubricants used in large conveyor systems. This wasn't something a boy would have picked up on a walk through the woods or while playing in a park. It pointed to a much more controlled environment, most likely an industrial facility or warehouse where the shoes had been stored for an extended period. Then came the finding that stopped everyone cold. Swabs taken from the shoelaces yielded touch DNA. Microscopic skin cells shed when someone handles an object. The profiles that emerged were degraded, but clear enough to produce a match in the state's criminal database. The name that came back was Calvin Roach. Roach had no direct connection to Ethan in the original investigation. His name had never appeared in the case file. In 1994, he had been 32 years old, living in a rural township about 40 miles from Millbrook. He worked nights at a grain mill, operating heavy equipment in a sprawling complex of silos, conveyors, and storage rooms. The mill sat less than 2 miles from a side road that branched off River Road, a fact that made Kerr pause. In the summer, Ethan vanished. Roach's schedule and location would have placed him in the vicinity at exactly the right time. The database records showed that Roach had no convictions for violent crimes, but his name had entered the system after a 2007 arrest for theft, during which his DNA was collected and stored. He had died in 2019 of natural causes, leaving behind a sparse record and no immediate family in the area. On paper, he was an unremarkable man, someone who could have easily gone unnoticed in a small town or a rural county. But the presence of his DNA on Ethan's shoelaces nearly 30 years later was impossible to ignore. Kerr began digging into Roach's history, piecing together what scraps of information she could find. Employment records confirmed his years at the grain mill, always on night shifts, often alone in certain sections of the plant. The mill itself had been a major employer in the region, but it also had vast areas that were rarely visited by anyone but maintenance crews. The industrial dust found on the shoes was a perfect match for the mill's environment. She reached out to former co-workers, many of whom were now elderly or scattered across the state. Most remembered Roach as quiet, someone who kept to himself. He had a small trailer on the edge of town and was known to hunt and fish on weekends. A few recalled that he sometimes camped near the river during the summer months, preferring the solitude to staying in town. When Kerr asked if any of them had ever seen him driving a blue pickup, 2 former employees said yes. One even remembered it being old and dented, with a loud engine, eerily similar to the description given by the witness back in 1994. The more Kerr learnt, the more the puzzle pieces began to shift into place. Roach's work schedule meant he often drove along River Road in the late afternoons, heading to the mill before his shift. His habit of camping near the river put him close to the spot where Ethan's bike had been found, and the industrial dust on the shoes suggested they had been stored in the mill for some length of time, perhaps hidden in one of the many locked storage rooms that only employees could access. Still, without Roach alive to question, everything was circumstantial. The DNA on the laces proved he had handled the shoes, but it couldn't confirm when, where, or under what circumstances. He could have found them abandoned, or he could have been the one to take them from Ethan's feet. The gap between those possibilities was wide, but the weight of coincidence pressed heavily against the idea of innocence. Kerr knew she was looking at a man who had likely slipped through the cracks in 1994, simply because no one had known to look at him. The question now was why, after so many years, the shoes had surfaced. If Roach had kept them, who had them after his death? Who had decided to place them on Margaret Miller's porch at 3:14 a.m.? The forensic report, while answering one question, had opened an entirely new set. And somewhere in the overlap between a grain mill 40 miles away, a quiet man with a blue pickup, and a pair of worn sneakers left on a porch, lay the truth of what had happened to Ethan Miller. Kerr's next step would be to find out what Roach had left behind, and whether the place he once worked still held more than just the dust that had clung to those shoes for nearly 3 decades. In the months after the discovery of Calvin Roach's DNA on Ethan's sneakers, Detective Rachel Kerr dug deeper into the life of the man who had died 3 years before. The answers didn't come quickly. Roach had been the kind of person who left almost nothing behind in writing. No journals, no close friends, no surviving spouse or children. What she did find came in fragments, gathered from conversations with distant relatives and men who had once worked alongside him at the grain mill. None of them claimed to know him well, but their recollections painted the same unsettling portrait: a man who kept to himself, who avoided casual conversation, and who had an unnerving habit of disappearing for hours without explanation. One of Roach's cousins, a man in his 70s who still lived in the county, mentioned something that stopped Kerr in her tracks. Roach, he said, had access to an old storage building just off the mill property. It had been part of the facility decades earlier, back when the company used it to store surplus grain sacks and machinery. By the 1990s, it was abandoned, left to collect dust and rodents. Roach, however, had kept a key, using the building as a personal workshop and a place to keep his hunting gear. It was out of the way, the kind of structure no one had reason to enter without a purpose, and back in 1994, police had never searched it. Kerr pulled the original investigation records, scouring them for any mention of this building. There was none. She filed for a warrant, citing the forensic link to Roach and the proximity of the storage space to his workplace. During the summer, Ethan vanished. In January 2023, accompanied by a team of officers and crime scene technicians, she entered the building for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. The windows were boarded, allowing only narrow slits of light to fall across the concrete floor. Dust coated every surface, disturbed only by the movement of mice and the occasional drip of water from the roof. Against the far wall stood a row of rusted metal lockers, their doors streaked with corrosion. Most were empty, their contents long since rotted or stolen. But one was different. It was locked, the padlock old but still intact. When it was cut open, the first thing visible was a torn backpack, its faded fabric frayed at the seams. Inside were school supplies frozen in time, a cracked plastic pencil case, a notebook with childish handwriting, and a folded paper football. Kerr's hands tightened around the straps as she read the name scrawled inside in black marker: Ethan Miller. Beneath the backpack lay a small wristwatch, its face scratched but still legible. The second hand was stopped at exactly 4:16, though whether from a dead battery or something else, no one could say. Then came the most chilling discovery. At the very back of the locker was a warped envelope containing a stack of photographs. The first image showed Ethan sitting on what looked like a narrow bed, the background too dark to make out clearly. His hair was longer, his face thinner, and his posture slouched but alert. In the next photo, he held a small paperback book, looking directly at the camera. The following images showed him in the same dim room, wearing different shirts, suggesting the pictures had been taken over weeks, possibly months. The final photograph in the stack was dated December 1995. In it, Ethan's eyes appeared tired, his frame gaunt. There were no photographs after that, no signs of his condition or fate beyond that winter. But the absence spoke volumes. Coupled with the condition of the building, the location, and the evidence of long-term confinement, investigators concluded that Ethan had been held captive there, or in a similarly concealed location, for more than a year after his disappearance. Somewhere between late 1995 and early 1996, that captivity had ended, almost certainly with his death. The realization was devastating, not only for Kerr, but for everyone who had carried even a sliver of hope that Ethan might have survived. There were still no remains, no definitive cause of death, but the implication was unavoidable. Roach had not only taken Ethan, he had kept him hidden in plain sight, using his access to the mill and its forgotten spaces to conceal his crime. Kerr left the building that day with the weight of those photographs pressing against her chest, the images burnt into her mind. She knew they would be even harder for Margaret Miller to see, yet they were also the most concrete proof in 28 years of what had happened after that bike was left by the fence. The search for Ethan had always been about finding the truth. Now, at last, pieces of it were in hand, but they came without the possibility of bringing him home alive. The next step would be to find out who had placed those shoes on Margaret's porch. Because if they had come from the same building, from the same hidden life that ended in the mid-90s, then someone else would have known. Someone had carried a piece of Ethan's story in silence for years before deciding to leave it at the doorstep of the only person who had never stopped waiting. And if that person could be found, they might be the last living link to the missing 28 years. By the spring of 2023, Detective Rachel Kerr had reached the point where the evidence told a story too complete to ignore. The photographs from the storage building, the industrial dust embedded in the sneakers, the DNA on the laces, and the witness accounts of a blue pickup all converged on one conclusion. Calvin Roach had been the man who intercepted Ethan on River Road in July 1994. He had taken him off his bike in that narrow window between sightings and hidden him away in a place only he had access to. The photographs proved that Ethan had survived for more than a year after the day the search ended, a captive in the shadows of the grain mill's forgotten spaces. And then, sometime between late 1995 and early 1996, his life had ended there. Whether by deliberate act or neglect, Roach had erased him, leaving no remains, no burial site, no marker, only objects that spoke in place of a body. The shoes, Kerr believed, had been Roach's trophy, a memento kept not out of sentiment, but possession, the same way some criminals hold on to something small from their victim as proof of what they've done. For nearly 3 decades, they had been stored somewhere, untouched until Roach's death in 2019. What happened next was still guesswork, but Kerr's theory was that when his belongings were sorted or cleared out by a landlord, a relative, or someone from his old life, the shoes resurfaced. Whoever found them had recognized them, or at least understood they belonged to a missing boy. And for reasons unknown, guilt, fear, or some personal need for the truth to be seen, they had walked them to Margaret Miller's porch and left them there in the dark. Tracking that final delivery proved impossible. The 3:14 a.m. footsteps on the neighbor's security audio were the only trace. No vehicles tied to anyone connected with Roach, no fingerprints on the shoes beyond the degraded touch DNA already identified. It was as if the person had emerged from the darkness, completed the act, and disappeared again into it. Kerr knew the trail would end there, but the rest of the puzzle no longer felt unsolvable. She could now place Ethan's final chapter in a specific space and time. For Margaret, the revelation was both the end of a search and the beginning of a new kind of grief. Kerr visited her in person, laying the photographs on the kitchen table one by one. Margaret's hands trembled as she looked at them, the boy with longer hair, the thinner cheeks, and the tired eyes. She asked no questions at first, only stared as if memorizing every line of his face all over again. Then she touched the final photo, the one dated December 1995, and whispered that she could see the same look in his eyes that she'd seen when he was sick as a child, a quiet, patient endurance. Kerr explained the storage building, the theory of how the shoes had been left, and the likelihood that Roach had acted alone. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on the shoes resting in a sealed evidence bag on the table beside the photographs. When Kerr told her there would likely never be remains to bury, Margaret nodded slowly, as though she had already known that truth for years. In the weeks that followed, Margaret moved through her house differently. The dining room, which for nearly 3 decades had served as a wall-to-wall archive of the case, began to change. The maps came down first, rolled carefully and stored in a box. The binders followed, each one sealed shut and stacked neatly in the attic. Newspaper clippings yellowed from time and sunlight were slid into folders, labeled but out of sight. It wasn't erasure. It was containment. For the first time since 1994, the dining room looked like a room again. She kept the shoes, not in a display, not on a shelf, but in a plain wooden box on the top of her bedroom closet. They weren't a comfort, not exactly, but they were proof, a physical connection to the boy she had raised and lost. Whenever she opened the box, the faint smell of aged canvas and rubber brought back the sound of his feet running down the hall, the slap of sneakers on the pavement. In Millbrook, news of the case's resolution spread quietly. There was no press conference, no dramatic headline, just word of mouth among the older residents who still remembered the search, the posters, and the fear. Some expressed outrage that Roach had lived out his life without being brought to justice. Others were unsettled by the thought that Ethan had been so close for so long, but for most, it was simply the end of a story that had haunted the town's edges for nearly 3 decades. Margaret never learnt who had returned the shoes, and she no longer asked. In her mind, it was enough that they had come home, carried by someone who had, in their own way, given her back a piece of her son. The answers were incomplete, the justice imperfect, but the uncertainty that had defined her life for 28 years had finally begun to lift. On a cool evening in early summer, she sat on the porch with the light on, as she'd done countless times before. But this time, she wasn't waiting for a knock. She was watching the quiet street, knowing that somewhere out there, someone had chosen to give her the one thing she never thought she'd have again, a piece of Ethan, real and tangible. And though the truth that came home was dark, it was hers now, and it was enough to let her finally close the door.